January 17, 1943. A frozen wind swept across the barren fields of Eastern Europe. Darkness stretched like an unbroken veil, broken only by the pale glow of the moon reflecting off frost-covered terrain. The world seemed still, but beneath the quiet, tension thrummed, a waiting predator, a hidden danger. In a camouflaged foxhole, a lone gunner crouched beside his artillery piece. His breath formed small clouds in the icy air. Around him, the silhouettes of destroyed vehicles and scattered equipment hinted at battles fought hours before. He adjusted his optics, scanning the horizon where shadows twisted into the faint outlines of enemy patrols. He had a plan, a doctrine born not from textbooks, but from countless nights spent learning to see what others could not. Movements, sounds, glints of metal, all became part of a map only he could read. Tonight, he would test it fully. Every heartbeat measured time. Every shadow held life or death. And under the cold, watchful moon, he prepared to turn the darkness itself into his deadliest weapon. The battlefield waited. The night would remember. By early 1943, the Eastern Front had become a grinding theater of attrition. The German Wehrmacht, after initial successes in Operation Barbarossa, faced the relentless push of the Soviet Red Army. Cities and villages had become front lines, and winter brought its own set of challenges. Snowdrifts, concealed mines, and barbed wire. Rivers froze into deceptive pathways, and the bitter cold tested the endurance of every soldier. Nightfall was no longer just the end of the day. It was a separate battlefield altogether. Night combat in this era was a precarious dance of shadows and noise. Armies relied on flares, searchlights, and crude communication to coordinate movements. Infantry advanced cautiously, fearing ambushes in the dark. Artillery units fired by estimation, often with limited visibility. Tanks and armored vehicles became massive, silent predators when night fell, but without precise coordination, they risked hitting their own troops. Commanders struggled to adapt. Traditional daytime doctrines failed once darkness claimed the terrain. In this environment, small units often became isolated. Patrols moved along frozen roads, relying on instinct and experience rather than maps. Signals were intercepted or missed entirely. Soldiers learned to fear the sounds of the unseen, the snap of a twig, the soft crunch of snow under boots, the distant hum of a motor. Every decision carried amplified risk. Survival depended on patience, perception, and initiative. It was within one such German artillery regiment that the gunner emerged. Assigned to a forward observation post, he was responsible for directing fire during the most dangerous hours. His unit had endured months of night operations, often suffering losses due to poor coordination and inadequate intelligence. He observed patterns that others overlooked. The ways shadows shifted with the moon, the subtle changes in enemy movement, the faint reflections of metal in the snow. These observations began to form the foundation of what he would call his Moonlight Doctrine. The gunner's tools were simple, yet vital. He had a light field artillery piece, a pair of binoculars, and a small cadre of men trained in silent observation. His position was often exposed to the elements, frozen ground, biting wind, but offered a wide view of the surrounding terrain. Standard operating procedures dictated caution. Yet he saw opportunity in the very darkness that others feared. Night could be a weapon if wielded correctly, he realized, transforming concealment into advantage, hesitation into decisive action. Meanwhile, enemy forces were equally challenged. Soviet patrols moved cautiously along frozen roads, often unaware of German positions hidden in the terrain. Coordination between units was hampered by darkness and snow, forcing reliance on predictable patterns and routes. The gunner noticed these routines and began to catalog them mentally, identifying when and where attacks were likely to occur. He understood that exploiting such patterns required not just observation, but timing, a deadly rhythm dictated by the moon's glow and the enemy's movements. The broader war situation added pressure. Supply lines were stretched thin, reinforcements were slow, and winter storms immobilized transport. Both sides faced exhaustion and attrition. Commanders emphasized the need to maintain initiative, yet conventional daylight assaults had become increasingly costly. It was the darkness that offered an opening, if one had the insight and courage to seize it. The gunner's thinking was methodical. Each night, he tested hypotheses. How far could he see in partial moonlight? How would artillery fire illuminate or conceal positions? What noises betrayed movement, and which were natural? Through trial and careful observation, he began to develop a doctrine based on patience, precision, and understanding of the terrain under moonlight. His approach contrasted sharply with Saint's standard orders, which emphasized massed daytime maneuvers or indiscriminate bombardment at night. This period also reflected a larger shift in warfare. As technology advanced, night optics, radio communication, and mechanized units, the ability to fight effectively in darkness became increasingly significant. Yet, the human element remained decisive. Soldiers who could read the night, anticipate movement, and act decisively held an advantage that no mechanical innovation could fully replicate. By the time the moon rose on January 17, 1943, this gunner was prepared. Months of careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and understanding of both his own and enemy limitations had brought him to a point where night was no longer a challenge. It was an ally. Every frozen shadow, every glint of ice, every distant noise was a signal. And with the first stirrings of enemy movement, the stage was set for a demonstration of the doctrine that would redefine night combat for those who survived to witness it. The gunner's early experiences during winter nights were harsh and unforgiving. His first patrols into the frozen darkness were lessons in patience and observation. On some nights, the snow acted as a blanket, muffling every footstep, making it nearly impossible to detect approaching enemy soldiers. On others, the ice glinted under starlight, giving away positions that seemed otherwise invisible. He began to see patterns where others saw only chaos. Enemy patrols followed predictable routes. Vehicles traversed the same stretches of frozen road, and sentries maintained rigid watch schedules. These recurring behaviors would later become the backbone of his tactical innovation. The environment itself became a silent instructor. Wind whispered through bare trees, carrying subtle sounds across the fields. Frost formed crystals that reflected faint moonlight, revealing contours and motion. The gunner's eyes adapted to the shifting darkness, learning to detect movements invisible to most. Binoculars, normally a tool for long-range spotting, became instruments for understanding behavior, how the enemy adjusted to the terrain, where their weak points lay, and when to strike. He realized that effective night engagement was not simply a matter of firepower, but of timing, anticipation, and patience. At the same time, his unit faced the limitations of technology. Standard artillery pieces lacked advanced targeting optics for low-light conditions. Communication relied heavily on field radios, which were vulnerable to interception or malfunction. Rations were limited, and men struggled with frostbite and fatigue. Commanders hesitated to authorize aggressive night operations due to the inherent risks. Yet the gunners saw opportunity in these constraints. By integrating careful observation, precise positioning, and an understanding of enemy routines, he could maximize the effectiveness of his limited resources. The doctrine he began developing relied heavily on stealth and discretion. Unlike conventional nighttime bombardments, which relied on massed fire and noise to intimidate, his approach emphasized selective, targeted strikes. Enemy movements would be anticipated and countered before they realized they were under observation. Observation posts were carefully camouflaged, with minimal exposure to the elements and enemy detection. Each movement was deliberate. Each calculation weighed against the margin for error. The gunner taught his men to understand not just the technical aspects of their weaponry, but the psychological and environmental factors at PLs. The enemy's own challenges further shaped his thinking. Soviet forces, despite numerical advantage, struggled to maintain coordination under the cover of night. Units often advanced in small groups, relying on simple patterns for safety. Communication breakdowns were common, and missteps could lead to exposure or friendly fire incidents. The gunner recognized that these predictable behaviors could be exploited. By monitoring key routes and timing attacks based on lunar cycles and terrain conditions, he created a system where darkness itself became a tool rather than an obstacle. His Moonlight Doctrine, though still informal at this stage, represented a shift in tactical philosophy. Traditional commanders viewed night as a period of avoidance, an interval to conserve strength and prepare for daytime operations. He saw it as an arena where careful observation, patience, and precise engagement could yield disproportionate results. The doctrine relied on a combination of natural illumination, terrain familiarity, and behavioral anticipation to create tactical advantages that the enemy could not predict. Personal discipline became central to its execution. Long hours in freezing conditions required mental endurance as much as physical stamina. Every sighting, every auditory cue, and every fleeting glint of movement was recorded and analyzed. Decisions were made in near silence, with a focus on minimizing exposure while maximizing impact. The gunner's growing confidence was rooted not in luck, but in repeated observation, careful planning, and meticulous execution. By late January, the pieces were in place. Observation posts were established along key enemy approaches. Patrol schedules had been mapped, lunar patterns recorded, and firing positions optimized for both concealment and reach. The gunner had transformed months of study and experience into a coherent operational strategy. The night was no longer a barrier. It was a weapon. As enemy movements began to stir under the cold, silvery glow of the moon, the stage was set for the first full demonstration of the doctrine. Every element had been considered: the terrain, the enemy's predictable behavior, the capabilities of his unit, and the limitations imposed by the harsh winter. What followed would test the theory in practice, revealing whether darkness could truly be turned into the deadliest advantage. The first perspective to consider is human. Night combat tested soldiers' endurance, courage, and perception. The cold was relentless, biting through gloves and uniforms, seeping into muscles and bones. Every soldier faced the constant tension of the unknown. Shadows could conceal movement, but they could also hide death. For the gunner and his men, psychological resilience was as crucial as technical skill. Patience became a weapon. Long hours spent in frozen foxholes, eyes scanning the darkness, built a quiet intensity. Fear was ever present, but it was disciplined, channeled into vigilance rather than panic. Each heartbeat, each shallow breath, measured against the weight of potential outcomes. The human element determined the speed and accuracy of response. A lapse in attention could mean failure, not just for a mission, but for survival. The gunner recognized this and trained his men to trust their instincts, while relying on methodical observation, creating a unit capable of performing under extreme pressure. From a tactical angle, the Moonlight Doctrine leveraged the darkness itself. Standard night maneuvers relied heavily on flares, searchlights, or prearranged movement orders, leaving soldiers predictable and vulnerable. The gunner's approach flipped this principle. He positioned his unit where natural moonlight illuminated the tears, rained selectively, allowing him to see the enemy without revealing his own location. Silent observation became the first stage of combat. Movements were anticipated and preempted rather than reacted to. Engagements were calculated, measured, and precise. The doctrine emphasized positional advantage and environmental awareness, turning snow, trees, and undulations in the frozen ground into tactical assets. Enemy patrols were funneled into zones where fire could be delivered efficiently, minimizing exposure and maximizing psychological impact. In effect, the doctrine allowed a smaller, well-prepared force to control larger enemy formations through strategy rather than brute force. Technological factors also played a significant role. Unlike daytime operations, night combat relied on subtle cues and limited tools. The gunner's equipment was standard for the era: field artillery, binoculars, rudimentary rangefinders, but the application was innovative. Optics were used not merely for distance measurement, but for pattern recognition. Small reflectors, moonlit glints, and snow-covered terrain became intelligence indicators. Radios were reserved for essential coordination, minimizing the risk of interception. Even artillery shells were chosen with care. Illumination rounds signaled positions without giving away the gunner's exact location, and high-explosive rounds were timed based on predicted enemy patterns. While technology alone could not win the battle, its careful integration into human observation and tactical planning amplified the doctrine's effectiveness. Leadership provided another crucial angle. The gunner was not only an operator, but also an organizer and teacher. He instructed his men in the nuances of observation, the patience required for sustained vigilance, and the discipline needed to execute attacks with precision. Decisions were made collectively, but under his guidance, ensuring that initiative remained controlled. He balanced risk and opportunity, understanding that overzealous action could compromise the entire position. Leadership in this context meant instilling confidence, ensuring clarity under uncertainty, and maintaining cohesion in the face of extreme environmental and psychological stress. His ability to motivate and direct under the darkness transformed a small unit into a formidable force. The enemy perspective reveals how predictable patterns could be exploited. Soviet patrols and reconnaissance units followed established routines, often unaware of the observation points concealed along their routes. Night movement, intended to provide cover, became a liability when systematically analyzed. The gunner recognized weaknesses in their standard practices: reliance on flares that revealed positions, predictable rest points, and habitual response timings. By studying these behaviors, he could anticipate advances, prepare effective fire zones, and strike decisively before the enemy realized they were compromised. From their perspective, attacks appeared sudden, almost supernatural, feeding a sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. Finally, the moral and psychological impact on troops cannot be understated. The knowledge that one's position could be monitored and targeted with lethal accuracy at night created both fear and caution. For the gunner's men, mastery of the Moonlight Doctrine instilled confidence, a sense of control over the chaos of darkness. Soldiers learned to see the night as an ally rather than an enemy. For opposing forces, the doctrine undermined morale, introducing hesitation where decisiveness was required. In combat, Morale was as decisive as weaponry, shaping engagement outcomes in subtle but profound ways. The doctrine operated on both a practical and psychological level, magnifying its effectiveness. Together, these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, formed a comprehensive view of the Moonlight Doctrine. It was not a single innovation, but a synthesis of observation, discipline, ingenuity, and calculated risk. Each perspective reinforced the others. Human endurance allowed tactical precision. Technological awareness amplified observational insight. Leadership guided execution. Enemy patterns were exploited, and psychological effects amplified the doctrine's impact. The convergence of these factors set the stage for the doctrine's ultimate test. Observation, analysis, and planning reached their peak. The elements of darkness, discipline, and timing aligned for the first major operation that would demonstrate the gunner's method not as theory, but as a force capable of reshaping night combat. The second section of angles focuses on leadership, enemy adaptation, and the broader psychological and moral dimensions of the Moonlight Doctrine. These elements would ultimately determine not just tactical success, but the enduring impact of the innovation. Leadership under the doctrine required more than direction. It demanded foresight, adaptability, and trust in human judgment. The gunner had to orchestrate operations in near-total darkness, where mistakes could prove fatal. He prioritized training his men in independent observation, decision-making, and silent coordination. Orders were precise, yet flexible, allowing for adjustments as the night evolved. He emphasized restraint over impulse, timing over reaction, and the importance of understanding both terrain and enemy psychology. Under his guidance, the unit became a self-reliant organism, capable of executing complex operations with minimal communication. This combination of control and autonomy was crucial. Each soldier was both observer and executor, amplifying the effectiveness of the doctrine without revealing its full methodology to the enemy. From the enemy perspective, the doctrine introduced confusion and unpredictability. Soviet units accustomed to standard night tactics, predictable patrols, routine reconnaissance, and reliance on illumination, found themselves under attack in ways that seemed impossible to anticipate. The gunner's ability to anticipate enemy movement based on moonlight, terrain, and prior observation created the impression of omniscience. Advancing patrols were intercepted, vehicles funneled into kill zones, and positions struck with surgical precision. Commanders reported unusual casualty patterns and unexpected disruption in coordinated movements. The doctrine exploited systemic weaknesses, reliance on repetition, insufficient night reconnaissance, and overconfidence in limited intelligence. By turning standard enemy practices against them, the gunner achieved a disproportionate effect with limited resources. The psychological angle extended beyond the battlefield. For the gunner's men, mastery of the Moonlight Doctrine fostered confidence and resilience. They learned to read subtle cues in darkness, the reflection of ice, the sound of distant engines, the faint shift of shadows. Their awareness of the enemy's vulnerability became a source of morale. Conversely, opposing forces experienced heightened stress and uncertainty. Night no longer offered cover, but became a domain of fear. Troops hesitated, overanalyzed routine movements, and became increasingly susceptible to error. In a war where morale could tip the balance, the doctrine exerted influence as effectively as shells or bullets. Technological interplay also remained central. Field optics, though rudimentary compared to modern night vision, were used creatively. Binoculars, LARs and telescopic sights extended observational reach, while artillery was fired with timing and precision based on environmental cues rather than conventional targeting. The gunner experimented with low-light illumination rounds to expose enemy positions without betraying his own. Communications were minimal but highly strategic, ensuring coordination without compromising secrecy. The effective combination of available tools and human perception exemplified the doctrine's innovative approach, leveraging limited technology with superior tactical understanding. The moral dimension further defined the doctrine's uniqueness. The gunner's approach minimized unnecessary exposure to his own men while maximizing impact on enemy forces. Unlike indiscriminate night bombardments, the Moonlight Doctrine emphasized selective, controlled engagement. Ethical consideration was embedded in tactical planning. The goal was efficiency, not chaos. This restraint demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both strategy and consequence, reflecting a deeper comprehension of warfare's human cost. By achieving objectives with minimal collateral exposure, the doctrine preserved both manpower and operational integrity. Leadership, technology, human perception, and morality intertwined to produce a comprehensive system. The gunner's decisions were informed by cumulative observation, environmental awareness, and rigorous discipline. Each component of the doctrine reinforced the others. Tactical ingenuity relied on human perception. Psychological effects amplified operational success. Moral restraint guided precision. Technological tools enhanced, rather than replaced, human judgment. The synergy of these factors allowed a small unit to exert influence far beyond its numbers, transforming the night into a domain where skill, insight, and anticipation dominated brute force. Finally, the angle of innovation itself must be considered. The Moonlight Doctrine was not merely a set of techniques, it was a conceptual shift in the understanding of night combat. Traditional doctrines treated darkness as an obstacle to be mitigated. The gunner reframed it as a strategic asset. Observation, environmental analysis, and timing became primary weapons. The doctrine encouraged proactive engagement rather than reactive survival. It demonstrated that even in an era dominated by technology and massed formations, human ingenuity could redefine the battlefield. This mindset would influence not only immediate operations, but the broader understanding of tactical possibilities in low-visibility combat. The convergence of human skill, leadership, technology, enemy psychology, moral consideration, and innovative thinking created a force multiplier. The Moonlight Doctrine exemplified how a single, well-devised method could alter outcomes in conditions traditionally considered disadvantageous. It was a lesson in adaptation, patience, and precision, a reminder that mastery of environment and perception often outweighed sheer numbers or firepower. As the doctrine matured, the time came to test it fully. The months of observation, experimentation, and careful planning culminated in a decisive operation. This would be the moment where theory met reality, where the combination of angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, would be subjected to the ultimate test under the unforgiving darkness of winter. The stage was set for the gunner to demonstrate that the night could indeed be transformed into a deadliest advantage. February 2nd, 1943. The moon hung low over the frozen fields near a small village in the Eastern Front, casting silver light across snow-draped terrain. The gunner's observation post, concealed behind a ridge of ice and debris, overlooked a main supply route known to be frequented by enemy patrols. For weeks he had mapped every movement, every pause, every predictable behavior. Tonight, all that preparation would be put to the test. At 22:15, faint shadows appeared on the horizon. The first patrol of Soviet infantry, 3 squads strong, moved in tight formation along the frozen road. Moonlight reflected off their rifles and the metal edges of their vehicles. The gunner adjusted his optics, noting their speed, spacing, and apparent discipline. His men held their positions silently, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the silhouettes. Every movement had been rehearsed, every command memorized. By 22:20, the gunner initiated the first phase of the Moonlight Doctrine. Observation-guided artillery placement. No shells were fired blindly. His calculations accounted for the distance, snow density, and ambient wind. The first salvo landed just ahead of the patrol, sending a cloud of snow and ice into the air. The enemy froze, instinctively seeking cover, unaware of the hidden vantage point. The precision of the strike disrupted formation without alerting the wider column. A direct application of the doctrine, controlling the battlefield without immediate detection. The second phase involved selective engagement. The gunner directed small arms fire at the most exposed targets, creating controlled chaos. Soldiers trained under his guidance targeted enemy officers and machine gun teams, dismantling the patrol's command structure. The remaining soldiers attempted to retreat, but their routes had been anticipated. The frozen terrain, illuminated by moonlight, funneled them into prepared zones where the gunner's team could act decisively. The combination of observation, prediction, and controlled fire maximized effectiveness while minimizing risk to his own unit. By 22:45, the enemy patrol was neutralized. Casualties were significant, and survivors fled in disarray. The operation had achieved more than physical destruction. It had shattered confidence. Reports later indicated that the enemy misinterpreted the attack as the work of a larger force, demonstrating the psychological impact of the doctrine. For the gunner, the night was far from over. He knew larger movements were imminent, and patience remained critical. At 23:10, a convoy of trucks appeared, their engines muffled but detectable under the still, cold night. This was the main engagement, the moment the doctrine had been designed to address. Using prior observations, the gunner positioned his artillery to cover choke points along the road. Moonlight revealed contours in the snow, indicating areas where vehicles would naturally slow or cluster. Timing would be everything. The first artillery shells landed precisely where anticipated, halting the convoy without warning. Smoke and debris created temporary concealment, but the gunner's team, trained in the Moonlight Doctrine, maintained situational awareness. Infantry units executed flanking maneuvers, striking with silent, deliberate efficiency. Communication was limited to hand signals and brief visual cues, ensuring coordination without revealing positions to the enemy. The operation unfolded as a carefully orchestrated sequence, each action anticipating the enemy's response. By 23:40, chaos had fully enveloped the convoy. Trucks were disabled, drivers incapacitated, and supply lines severed. Enemy forces attempted counterattacks, but every advance had been anticipated and countered. The combination of environmental advantage, tactical placement, and human precision created an effect far greater than the size of the gunner's unit. It was not merely firepower that dictated outcomes, it was foresight, preparation, and content. Role of the terrain under moonlight. Throughout the engagement, the gunner remained in his observation post, a calm center amid the unfolding storm. He monitored the battlefield with unwavering focus, adjusting fire and directing his men with subtle signals. The discipline and training instilled over months of preparation were now validated. Small errors were corrected in real time, and every action was deliberate. Each minute confirmed that the Moonlight Doctrine was more than theory. It was a tactical force multiplier capable of achieving decisive results in conditions traditionally considered disadvantageous. By midnight, the engagement concluded. The enemy had been decisively disrupted, supply lines damaged, and morale severely weakened. Casualty estimates later confirmed the operation's effectiveness, while survivor reports highlighted the confusion and disorientation caused by the gunners' precision strikes. Commanders on both sides took note. A small, well-trained unit, using observation, anticipation, and environmental advantage, could control outcomes far beyond its numbers. This night demonstrated the turning point in how night combat could be approached. The gunner had converted months of observation, experimentation, and discipline into a coherent, executable doctrine. The Moonlight Doctrine had transformed darkness from an obstacle into a strategic weapon. It validated the idea that anticipation, patience, and precise application of force could achieve results conventionally thought impossible in low-visibility conditions. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the battlefield bore silent testimony to the night's events. Snow was scorched and cratered. Vehicles were overturned, and the faint tracks of retreating soldiers traced patterns the gunner had anticipated. The night had ended, but its lessons were indelible. The Moonlight Doctrine had not only won a tactical engagement, it had rewritten the rules for how night combat could be approached on the Eastern Front. The success of this operation set the stage for subsequent engagements. The doctrine would be applied again, refined, and studied. Commanders on both sides would take note, and the principles developed here would echo through the strategies of future night operations. But before examining those implications, the immediate impact, the human, tactical, and strategic consequences of this decisive night must be understood. Following the decisive engagement of February 2, 1943, the battlefield remained tense. The enemy was disoriented, their command fractured by precise, premeditated strikes. The gunners' team, though small, had demonstrated that mastery of observation, timing, and terrain could multiply the effectiveness of limited forces. Reports later confirmed that the convoy's destruction delayed resupply to forward Soviet units by several days, creating strategic consequences beyond the immediate engagement. As the night progressed, reconnaissance indicated the approach of additional enemy forces. These units, unaware of the prior ambush, advanced along predictable routes. The gunner adapted, extending the Moonlight Doctrine to cover multiple engagement points. Observation posts relayed subtle signals. Men positioned along the flanks maintained concealed readiness. Timing remained critical. Shells and gunfire were delivered with calculated pauses, exploiting the natural silences of the frozen landscape. Each action maintained the illusion of overwhelming force, reinforcing the psychological impact on the enemy. At 01:15, the second wave of the enemy column encountered the prepared kill zones. Vehicles were stopped abruptly by artillery, infantry faced targeted fire, and retreat paths were anticipated and blocked. Chaos ensued, amplified by the cold and darkness. The gunners' team maintained cohesion, executing maneuvers with precision honed through months of training and study. Every movement was deliberate, every shot calculated. The Moonlight Doctrine had proven itself as more than a tactical experiment. It was a doctrine capable of dictating the rhythm of battle under adverse conditions. By 0200, resistance began to collapse. Enemy units fragmented, some retreating in disarray, others captured or neutralized. The gunner monitored each development, adjusting fire to exploit openings and avoid friendly casualties. His patience and control were central. The doctrine relied not on speed, but on timing, anticipation, and measured force. The cold, moonlit terrain became both shield and tool, shaping the enemy's movements as decisively as any artillery shell. Throughout the engagement, the gunner demonstrated the importance of continuous adaptation. The enemy attempted minor counterattacks, deploying machine guns and small flanking units to regain momentum. Each move had been anticipated. Artillery and small arms fire intercepted every attempt, leaving opponents disoriented and exhausted. The Moonlight Doctrine's integration of observation, environmental analysis, and behavioral prediction allowed the gunner's unit to maintain control despite numerical inferiority. This was a clear illustration of strategic ingenuity in the face of adversity. The success of the operation was not merely tactical. Reports collected afterward emphasized the psychological toll on enemy forces. Soldiers described phantom fire from unseen positions, disoriented by the precision and timing of strikes. Commanders noted an increased reluctance to advance at night, altering operational tempo and strategy. The Moonlight Doctrine had imposed fear and uncertainty without the need for overwhelming numbers, demonstrating that mastery of the environment and careful timing could yield effects greater than brute force. Within the gunner's own unit, confidence surged. Months of preparation had been validated. Observation posts were reinforced, routines standardized, and lessons meticulously recorded. The doctrine was no longer experimental. It had proven its efficacy in real-world conditions. Soldiers understood that darkness, once a source of risk, could be a tactical advantage when leveraged correctly. The night was no longer a constraint, but a controlled element of operational planning. The wider implications became apparent to higher command. Reports described how small, disciplined units could disrupt entire enemy operations, forcing reconsideration of night patrols, supply movements, and defensive planning. The principles demonstrated by the gunner, anticipation, environmental mastery, and precise selective engagement, would influence future night operations across multiple fronts. The integration of human skill with environmental and technological awareness became a model for subsequent strategic planning. By 0330, the battlefield quieted. Enemy resistance had largely dissipated, leaving a scene marked by disruption and tactical advantage. The gunner conducted final assessments, verifying positions, tracking retreating units, and ensuring his men remained concealed until complete safety was achieved. The operation had maintained strict discipline, avoiding unnecessary exposure or casualties, reflecting the core ethical and strategic principles of the doctrine. The climax of the Moonlight Doctrine on that February night showcased a transformation in combat philosophy. Night, once a limitation, had been transformed into a decisive factor. The gunner's methods demonstrated that understanding terrain, predicting enemy behavior, and exercising controlled, precise action could achieve outcomes previously thought impossible in darkness. The doctrine combined human observation, tactical insight, leadership, technological application, and psychological manipulation into a coherent system of warfare. As dawn approached, the frozen landscape bore silent testimony to the night's events. Disabled vehicles, disrupted formations, and traces of retreating troops marked the effectiveness of the strategy. The gunner's careful orchestration had turned potential vulnerability into overwhelming advantage. The Moonlight Doctrine had not only achieved immediate tactical success, but had reshaped perceptions of night combat itself. Commanders on both sides would take note, reassessing assumptions and revising operational planning. The night's operation set the stage for lasting consequences on the Eastern Front. Supply lines were disrupted, enemy morale was weakened, and the potential for future engagements under darkness became a central consideration. The doctrine's principles would echo beyond this single battle, influencing both tactical and strategic approaches to night operations. The demonstration of patience, anticipation, and disciplined execution marked a turning point, not only in the gunner's career, but in the broader understanding of how darkness could be transformed into a weapon. The immediate aftermath of the February 2, 1943 operation was stark and measurable. Enemy casualties were significant, though exact numbers varied in reports. Soviet records indicated that several squads had been entirely neutralized, while numerous vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The disruption of supply lines had ripple effects. Forward units went without reinforcements, ammunition, and essential provisions for days. Commanders on both sides recognized that the night had been transformed into a domain of decisive action, rather than a period of passive waiting. The Moonlight Doctrine had demonstrated that darkness could serve as both shield and weapon, offering a tactical advantage to those prepared to exploit it. Within the gunner's unit, morale was elevated. Months of rigorous training and preparation had culminated in a tangible victory. Soldiers understood that careful observation, patience, and precise execution could yield results disproportionate to the unit's size. Confidence in the doctrine translated into operational efficiency. Every soldier knew his role, anticipated the enemy's behavior, and trusted in the coordinated execution of the plan. The human factor, the discipline in focus and intervenes and even endurance of trained men, had amplified the doctrine's impact. Reports and reconnaissance confirmed that enemy forces were not only physically disrupted, but psychologically shaken. Officers noted increased hesitancy in night movements, a clear shift in tactics. Patrols that previously relied on predictable routines now avoided certain routes or altered their schedules, demonstrating the Moonlight Doctrine's broader influence beyond the immediate engagement. Fear and uncertainty had become weapons in themselves. The gunner had not only destroyed enemy units, but had instilled a sense of vulnerability, changing the enemy's perception of night operations across the sector. Technologically, the doctrine highlighted the effective use of available tools under extreme conditions. Field artillery, binoculars, and limited communication devices had been used with exceptional precision. Shells were delivered with timing that accounted for terrain, wind, and moonlight, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the operational environment. While technology alone could not achieve these results, its integration into a well-prepared tactical plan magnified effectiveness. The engagement became a case study in how modest resources, applied strategically, could outperform sheer numerical advantage. The strategic implications were immediate. Higher command recognized that small, disciplined units using the Moonlight Doctrine could disrupt larger enemy operations, delay supply chains, and force reconsideration of standard defensive measures. The doctrine had shifted the operational calculus. Where darkness was once a liability, it was now an exploitable asset. Enemy behavior, previously predictable, was now influenced by the anticipation of unseen forces. Supply routes, patrol patterns, and unit deployments required constant reassessment in light of the doctrine's demonstrated effectiveness. Ethically and morally, the doctrine demonstrated a disciplined approach to engagement. Unlike indiscriminate night bombardments, the Moonlight Doctrine emphasized targeted, calculated action. Casualties among enemy forces were the result of deliberate positioning and timing, rather than indiscriminate fire. Simultaneously, the gunner's careful orchestration minimized exposure and risk to his own men. This balance of efficiency and restraint underscored the doctrine's sophistication, achieving objectives decisively while preserving human life and operational integrity whenever possible. The immediate battlefield also revealed the environmental advantages leveraged by the doctrine. Moonlight, snow, and frozen terrain had become critical tools. Observation and prediction relied on understanding how light reflected off surfaces, how shadows shifted, and how movement could be anticipated in frozen conditions. The gunner had transformed these natural elements into strategic instruments, illustrating that mastery of the environment could produce effects greater than raw force. Finally, documentation of the engagement highlighted the doctrinal shift. Field reports, after-action notes, and reconnaissance summaries emphasized the precision, timing, and psychological impact of the operation. Both friendly and enemy records acknowledged the effectiveness of a small, well-prepared unit under the cover of darkness. These accounts would inform future tactical planning, reinforcing the importance of observation, anticipation, and disciplined execution in night combat. The culmination of these factors, the human element, tactical planning, technological integration, environmental mastery, and psychological impact, set the stage for broader operational considerations. The immediate success of the Moonlight Doctrine was more than a tactical victory. It marked a turning point in the understanding of night warfare. Commanders recognized that similar principles could be applied in future operations, fundamentally altering expectations of what could be achieved under darkness. As daylight broke over the frozen terrain, the battlefield was silent, yet the consequences of the night's events were profound. The enemy's physical and psychological losses had been severe, while the gunner's unit emerged not only victorious, but transformed. The effectiveness of the Moonlight Doctrine had been proven, and its influence would ripple through subsequent operations, reshaping the approach to night combat on the Eastern Front and beyond. In the days following the operation, the broader implications of the Moonlight Doctrine became increasingly evident. Enemy forces adjusted their tactics, reducing night patrols and avoiding routes where the doctrine had been applied. Soviet commanders issued orders for stricter reconnaissance and altered movement schedules, yet these measures were reactive, often implemented too late to prevent further disruption. The psychological impact persisted, instilling caution and hesitation that slowed operational tempo and limited initiative. The doctrine had achieved an effect disproportionate to the physical size of the gunner's unit, influencing enemy behavior and decision-making without additional engagement. Within the gunner's own forces, lessons were recorded and codified. The principles of observation, timing, environmental mastery, and selective engagement became central to training new recruits. Units were instructed to view darkness not as a limitation, but as a resource, integrating moonlight, terrain, and enemy behavior into operational planning. Commanders began to recognize the strategic potential of small, disciplined units capable of controlling engagement outcomes at night, fundamentally shifting the understanding of operational effectiveness in low-visibility conditions. The doctrine's influence extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Reports circulated among higher command, emphasizing the efficacy of the Moonlight Doctrine in achieving decisive outcomes with minimal resources. Artillery and infantry commanders studied the engagement, noting how anticipation and observation could replace brute force or massed formations. Field manuals began to incorporate lessons drawn from the operation, formalizing tactics for reconnaissance, observation, and engagement during nocturnal operations. This codification ensured that the doctrine would persist, guiding both current and future strategic planning. The technological lessons were equally significant. While the gunner had relied on standard field equipment, the precision and timing of its use highlighted the potential for optimizing available tools under extreme conditions. Binoculars, artillery, and limited-range communication devices were integrated into a system of observation and selective engagement that maximized their utility. Commanders recognized that sophisticated outcomes did not always require advanced technology. Instead, effective application, informed by human perception and disciplined coordination, could yield superior results. The immediate human impact was equally notable. Soldiers trained under the doctrine reported increased confidence and morale, understanding that their actions had measurable impact, and that mastery of observation and timing could compensate for numerical inferiority. Conversely, enemy soldiers expressed heightened fear of night operations, with diaries and reports noting a sense of unpredictability and vulnerability. The Moonlight Doctrine had therefore altered both sides' psychological approach to warfare, demonstrating that tactical innovation could influence perception as effectively as physical outcomes. Strategically, the doctrine contributed to a series of subsequent operations across the Eastern Front. Commanders applied similar principles to interdiction of supply lines, reconnaissance, and defensive positioning. By controlling movement under darkness, small units could impose disproportionate effects, delaying enemy advances and creating tactical opportunities for larger coordinated operations. The success of the doctrine encouraged experimentation with other methods of observation, environmental exploitation, and timing-based engagement, leading to a broader reevaluation of night combat strategy. Historians later noted that the Moonlight Doctrine exemplified a shift in operational philosophy. Traditional night operations were often defensive or passive. This approach demonstrated that proactive, calculated action could transform a perceived disadvantage into decisive advantage. By exploiting natural conditions, anticipating enemy behavior, and integrating disciplined human observation with available technology, the doctrine showcased a new dimension of tactical thinking that would resonate in military doctrine for decades. The gunner's role in this evolution was widely recognized within his unit and by higher command. His ability to observe, analyze, and execute under extreme conditions highlighted the critical importance of individual initiative combined with disciplined coordination. Training programs and operational protocols began to emphasize these qualities, reinforcing the idea that tactical innovation and environmental mastery could achieve results beyond conventional expectations. The doctrine's success also inspired a culture of observation, patience, and calculated risk-taking within the unit, ensuring that its principles would endure even as personnel changed. Ultimately, the Moonlight Doctrine's impact was multi-layered. Physically, it neutralized enemy patrols, disrupted supply lines, and inflicted casualties. Psychologically, it instilled fear, hesitation, and uncertainty within opposing forces. Strategically, it reshaped expectations for night operations, demonstrating that small, disciplined units could dictate engagement outcomes through observation, anticipation, and precise action. The operation became a case study in effective adaptation to environmental and human factors, influencing subsequent doctrine and shaping the broader conduct of warfare on the Eastern Front. As the snow melted and spring approached, the battlefield bore the traces of the doctrine's effectiveness. Abandoned equipment, disrupted supply routes, and enemy movements permanently altered by fear and uncertainty. The gunner and his unit had not only achieved a tactical victory, but had also created a lasting blueprint for night combat operations. The Moonlight Doctrine would echo in military planning, influencing approaches to low-visibility engagements and redefining how darkness could be transformed from obstacle to strategic asset. The Moonlight Doctrine stands as a testament to the power of observation, patience, and disciplined innovation in warfare. In an era defined by massed formations and technological escalation, it demonstrated that human insight and environmental mastery could redefine the rules of engagement. Darkness, once a source of fear and uncertainty, became a calculated ally. The doctrine illustrated that understanding terrain, anticipating enemy behavior, and executing with precision could produce effects far beyond what numbers or firepower alone could achieve. Its significance extends beyond the tactical success of February 2nd in 1943. The doctrine reshaped approaches to night combat, influencing how commanders conceptualized operations in low-visibility conditions. It proved that careful study of patterns, both human and environmental, could turn disadvantage into advantage. Small units, trained and disciplined, could dictate outcomes with minimal resources, demonstrating a fundamental truth of warfare. Strategy and foresight often outweigh brute force. The psychological dimension of the doctrine also left an enduring mark. By controlling what the enemy perceived in darkness, the gunner's unit imposed fear, hesitation, and uncertainty, magnifying the impact of each action. At the same time, it empowered those trained under the doctrine, instilling confidence, cohesion, and trust in their own skill. Warfare is as much a contest of minds as it is of weapons, and the Moonlight Doctrine exemplified this principle. Ultimately, the doctrine reminds us that innovation often emerges from constraint. Harsh winter conditions, limited technology, and a perilous environment forced adaptation. From these challenges arose a strategy that was precise, disciplined, and profoundly effective. It reshaped tactical thinking on the Eastern Front and left lessons that resonate across military history. Observation, anticipation, and control are as decisive as any artillery salvo, and the human capacity to adapt can transform even darkness into a weapon. The frozen fields of that January night became more than a battlefield. They became a proving ground for ingenuity and resilience. And in the quiet aftermath, as dawn broke over the snow, the Moonlight Doctrine stood as a legacy, a reminder that in war, perception and patience can wield as much power as any machine, and that the night itself can be turned into an ally